You're listening to a social justice podcast hosted by Nicholas Sperling, brought to you by The Flag Shop, and inspired by a social justice coloring book. Hello, I'm Nicholas Sperling, host of a social justice podcast. Today we're doing an episode on ageism, and I'm joined by Barbara Findlay. Barbara, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm a fat, old, white, cisgender, queer lawyer with disabilities. I grew up working class and was raised Christian in the prairies. And all of those aspects of my identity inform who I am and the work I do.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining me today to have this conversation about ageism. And to start with, would you like to tell us a little bit about your experiences with ageism?
Sure. At some point, somewhere along the line, my hair turned white. At some later point along the line, I was not so much working in the office as I used to be. So I wasn't so much located physically in a kind of designated workspace. And what began to happen to me, I noticed, was a phenomenon where people's eyes would not register that I was there. They would literally just kind of slide right over me and move on by. And it was quite startling because in the work I do, I'm accustomed to being not slid over is not the most common reaction to me being in a room. So I puzzled about it a little bit, and then it was COVID. And my friend came over and said that she was bringing me some hair clippers per my request, and she'd thrown in some hair dye in case I felt like dyeing my hair. So I took the hair dye from London Drugs and made a patch of my hair blue. And all of a sudden, people's eyes didn't slide over me anymore. Mm-hmm. And that was really interesting. People stop me on the street all the time to tell me how wonderful they think my hair is. Young, old, white, people of color, men, women, doesn't matter. And that made me puzzled in a different way. Like what? Yeah, okay. I think it's cool too, but not that cool. And what is it? What's at play here that people are now reacting to me in a really positive manner? And they're both ageism. And so the reaction to the blue-haired old lady has to do with, and it's an old lady with blue hair. Oh. That I wouldn't have got the same reaction if I was a 19-year-old with the same blue patch. It just would not attract the same kind of comments.
Because it's unexpected that you would have.
You're running counter to expectation. Mm-hmm. What that story does is illuminate the underlying, what do we expect of old people? And we expect of old people, first of all, that they are not seen. They're not even they're not part of the conversation. They're not a constituency that we look to. We're not. Look at me saying they. And when I say we, in this case, what I mean is we white folks, because traditions around age and aging are really different depending on what culture you're in. But for us white folks, once we stop working and thereby kind of showing up in the publicly defined credibility space, for want of a better term, then we just fall off the map. We don't matter anymore. As we get frailer, we eventually get warehoused. So my other current experience with ageism is my experience with my lesbian friend who's 82, and she has dementia, and she is now living in assisted living. That's a whole other construction of what do we mean by old or aging, because what we mean is out of sight and out of mind. We mean we pay people to look after old people as opposed to having those people continue to be part of our families in ways that would disrupt our own abilities to make money, for example. And the folks in that assisted living facility they're treated well, but they're not valued. So ageism, the essence of ageism, like the essence of any oppression, is a disqualification from participation in normal, in the kind of the circle of normalcy that you look for, that you look to for credibility or for agency or for those kinds of things. The ageism is like, in some ways, is like the way we treat children, because and again, when I say we, unless I mean otherwise, when I say we, I mean we white folks. We don't give agency or credibility to kids either, for the most part. So it's a really interesting thing that you kind of grow into credibility and you grow out of it as you're old.
That's something I've personally noticed is something around the time I turned 30, people started respecting me, not because I knew anything more or was any more skilled at whatever it was that they were respecting me for, just purely based off of my age. Suddenly I had the respect of the people around me that didn't exist in my early 20s. And I remember being in my early 20s and extremely frustrated that no one was taking me seriously. Mm-hmm. And it sounds like you go through this cycle of, once you're into sort of prime working life, that is when people respect you and take you seriously. And when you're on either end of that, not so much. Is that kind of what I'm hearing?
It certainly is organized around participation in the workforce, in paid labor. Because if you're not doing paid labor, then you're not a real person. Being unemployed is another way to be marginalized.
Right.
You don't get respect if you're unemployed. It's not you don't get respect. When I say you don't get respect, I don't mean, they're being mean to me. I mean something much more profound, which is that you don't get seen. You're treated as a problem rather than as a resource. You're treated as somebody about which other people will make decisions that will have impacts on. So there's a loss of agency involved in that. And that's common across oppressions.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think about sitcoms from the 90s, and anytime someone wasn't working, they're a deadbeat, they're a leech on the system, there are any number of negative connotations associated with the fact that they're not working, and people seem to only value you if you're providing value through work as opposed to whatever other forms of value you might be providing to our society.
Yeah.
You've kind of touched on this already just through your own personal experiences, but usually we try to start our podcast by defining what the topic is. So if you had to define what ageism is, how would you define that?
I would say that ageism is a socially accepted process of exclusion of people who are seen to be, quote, too old, unquote. Mm-hmm. And that the social processes of it are really to me, that's what's interesting, is how is it that we set it up so that at the end of our lives, what we can more or less expect to be is warehoused. Mm-hmm. Is that what an interesting choice that is that we're making? Because we're all going to end. It's not like that's where we put our parents, but it's not where we're going to go.
Oh, so what an interesting choice we've made as a society.
Culturally.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So ageism are the social practices of exclusion of old people.
Right. And do you think that's a commonly held belief that I'm putting my parents in a home, but I'm never going to end up there?
Well, here's the thing. One of the things about aging is that when you think about aging, pretty soon you have to think about death. And we have a culture that is absolutely terrified of thinking about death at all. So the closer that you get to the age where you might be dying, the more those conversations are likely, or you might want to be having those conversations if you're the old person, but younger people don't want to have those conversations. So I don't think young people I literally think they don't think about it.
Right. It's too scary of a thought, maybe. So
well, it's not even too scary. I mean, it's like it just doesn't come up.
Mm-hmm. Because there are societies in the world where death is sort of not necessarily celebrated, but you celebrate a person's life. You talk about death frequently from, with people of all ages.
Yep. Including most indigenous cultures.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just watching a video from Ghana where they were going through these incredible multi-day, week-long ceremonies to celebrate the lives of people who died. And there's a lot of sort of tragedy involved, people crying, but there's also this sense that we want to make this process of death something that we talk about and that we spend a lot of time focusing on.
That we teach our children about, and yeah.
Mm-hmm. Is ageism the same as age discrimination?
Well, it's not. I mean, they're different. They're words that relate to different aspects of the same thing, I guess. Age discrimination is a legal concept, and what that means is that you are denied access to goods or services or tenancy on the basis that you're of your age.
Mm-hmm.
Ageism is a set of cultural beliefs that we all have we white folks all have in us, which is when you get old, you're not, you're going to fall off the credibility cliff. That we assume that of our grandparents. We treat our grandparents like they're dear or that they're sweet.
Mm-hmm.
We don't treat them like they're wise.
Right.
In our culture. So that's ageism. That's the social construction of what it means to be old. Right. In this culture is a construction which very seriously disadvantages old people.
Mm-hmm. And I guess that kind of answers this question already, but if you have any other thoughts on it, why is ageism a problem?
Well, the first thing that comes to my mind when I ask that question is a problem for who? It's a problem for old people to the extent that we prefer to continue to participate in society in the ordinary kinds of ways and not be relegated to grandma status or like essentially a non-participatory role.
Right.
Is it a problem for younger people? Is it a problem for the generation of people whose parents are getting older? In my own parents, at the end of their lives, required a lot of care, and they were determined that they were not going to go into assisted facilities. So that meant that their children needed to provide the kind of day-to-day care that they needed. And we were entirely willing to do that. I spent about a year and a half spending a third of every month in Regina. But, I mean, though we were willing, it was not set up for us to, like that was not built in any sense of the word. There was, for example, an entirely inadequate support system of home support that might have enabled them to be more independent without having to rely on their kids.
Mm-hmm.
It means for people who don't have kids, particularly gay, lesbian, trans folk, we are much less likely to have kids who are around to be those caregivers.
You hear some horror stories about how queer folks are treated in long-term care homes as well.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Chris Morrissey did a project for Community now 10 or 15 years ago, going around to care homes and first inquiring and then educating about what it meant to have elders who are queer. But it means that for many of us in queer communities, the cost of going into assisted living is the cost of going back in the closet.
Right.
Because not safe.
That's such a sad place to be.
It's horrible. And if you're queer and you don't have friends in a generation younger than you are, Your friends are dying around you and are not able, or progressively less able, to offer mutual support.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, who's this working for exactly? Well, it's working for a culture, or a capitalist culture, that values economic enterprise above pretty much anything else, and the ability of workers to show up fed, clothed, housed, and ready to go, without responsibility on the employer for maintaining any of that.
Right.
And it's a one-at-a-time model, so workers are not really, their families of workers are not visible in that system in any way.
I wonder, too, if that is only not a problem in the short term, because I think to the expression, if you don't learn from your past, you're destined to repeat it, or however it's phrased. And I think if we're not respecting our elders in our communities and taking the time to learn about their experience, their history, how are we supposed to make sure that we don't go down the wrong path in the future? So if we're valuing just that working class of people and no one else, is that sustainable?
Well, there's a whole bunch wrong with the model. And, you know, Indigenous peoples teach us that the relevant frame is 7 generations. Us white folk, we literally don't look behind us to the people who've gone before us. And we don't really look forward. We certainly don't look 7 generations into the future when we consider the consequences of our actions. And so that's another illustration of the ways that corporations want you to, they want you shorn of your past and your future. They only want your healthy body presence. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I would imagine most of the people I know probably don't know further back than their great-grandparents. Maybe grandparents, great-grandparents are probably the last generation that they're very aware of. And, when we talk about looking into the future, clearly that's not something we're doing as a society.
No.
Since we're not addressing things like climate change.
We're completely divorced from the earth. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Who does ageism impact? We've talked about how it impacts people who've aged out of the workforce. Does it and also how it's impacted children? Does it impact people who are within the workforce in maybe more subtle ways? Or
well, it what it does is gives all of us a kind of frame of reference for understanding the world around us, which is limited to our own lifetimes. Mm-hmm. And we don't, that's appalling. So it's not only ageism that does that. It's not, I wouldn't say ageism, therefore X, because I think there's a whole lot of other things that are involved in making that so. Mm-hmm. But nevertheless, we have created a culture, we white folks have created a culture in which only that brief period, maybe from the time you're 20 till the time you're 65, 70, whatever that other end point is.
Can you maybe provide some examples of how ageism impacts people?
Well, sure. Like any oppression, the first way it impacts people is with internalized oppression, because I grew up in the very same culture as all the rest of the white folks, and I believe of myself that I am less worthy, less worthy of respect, less valuable, less important, less more problematic, more of a drain, and so on. And so why did I start dyeing my hair blue? Because I did not like the experience of having people's eyes slide over my face without registering that I was there, literally without registering I was there. And so that the impact of that kind of exclusion, like the impact of, that's a form of structural violence. And that structural exclusion also happens to people of color. It happens in many circumstances to women, in almost all circumstances to trans and queer folk. So the mechanics are somewhat different, but the result is the same. So the consequence of ageism is that it makes old people experience ourselves as less valuable and certainly not able to lay claim to, for example, wisdom.
Right. So you're saying that older people typically are not able to claim that that they are wise when they are, because they have feelings of not being worthy enough?
We don't even recognize that we're wise. Because, like everything, wisdom is a social construct. And so, if people start coming to me and asking my opinion, then all of a sudden I begin to value my own opinion. If people never come to me and ask me for my opinion, then pretty soon I get the very clear message that my opinion isn't valuable. So it's certainly not wise. So wisdom, like all of it, is a socially constructed phenomenon. But what we lose with ageism is we discount, we erase, we devalue the experience of people who've gone ahead of us and what they've got to teach us.
Right. And I mean, thinking about how I view you, I think of a very well-respected lawyer, which again is coming back to the profession as opposed to the person. So that's really interesting to think about. I wonder, is there a specific point in time where you just went, this thing happened in my life, like I've retired or whatever it might be, and so now I'm feeling like I'm not worth as much? Or is it sort of a slow progression as you age? You just kind of go, okay, something is different. People aren't treating me the same way.
Well, actually, the kind of literally the experience that made me go, what's going on here, was the experience of having people's eyes slide over me. I'm not accustomed to having people's eyes slide over me. And that made me know that I was now in a category. I was now viewed as being in a category of. Although I officially retired, I didn't ever actually entirely retire. And so I'm pretty sure that my own experience of that question would be really different if I was no longer doing any legal work.
Right.
Like if I was, in fact, outside of the working thing. And maybe one of the reasons I continue to work is because I don't want to go there. I don't, and the other thing about getting older is that at various rates and in various ways, our bodies begin to fail. And our bodies begin to fail in ways, many of my friends are now dying. I'm 73, and statistically speaking, half of the people who die before they're 73. So in some way, I'm now in the diminishing side of the bell curve, if you know what I mean. And that's the physicality of getting older and dying, which I don't see as being kind of separate things, is an area that the culture just really doesn't want to deal with. Just really doesn't. That kind of warehousing that happens as a response to that phenomenon is, honest to God, what you're doing is you're locking people up as a solution to a social problem.
I guess it's not the first time we've used that as a solution when it should
really
be.
But isn't that shocking? That is exactly what we're doing and choosing to do.
When things make us feel uncomfortable, we lock it away. And
that's right. Out of sight, out of mind.
And do you find it challenging? We've talked about this in some of the podcasts where we'll talk about discrimination based off of a certain aspect of who a person is. And sometimes if you have overlapping aspects, it could become difficult to figure out, why am I being treated differently? Is it because I'm queer? Is it because I'm old? Is it because... Do you find that challenge when it comes to ageism?
Well, in my own life, I do not, because my experience was so dramatic. And so, I see what's going on here. And all of the other factors of my identity remained the same.
So you have a control, essentially.
Exactly. I don't have children. And I'm really interested in the difference between my experience of aging and ageism compared to the experience of people my age who are now grandparents, for example. And because I think I think ageism plays out differently in family structure, in multi-generational family structures. I think that, using my own biological family as an example, as my parents became more infirm, we gradually treated them as being less competent, and we gradually took over decision-making, doing the driving, not accompanied by, certainly with love, but not accompanied by a sense of respect that I experience in Indigenous communities where, I really would draw a really sharp contrast between the way white folks do it and the way, in my experience, of Indigenous folks, because elders are elders, and elders are first, and elders, you go to events, there are always chairs for the elders, and there's always people assigned to make sure the elders are doing okay, and the elders get the best seats, and the elders get tea or water or whatever, and fed first, and honored. And it is an entirely different experience than it is in white culture, like entirely. When I went up to Musqueam one time, and then this was some while ago now, and somebody said to me, "Auntie, come sit," and I said, "Oh no, it's fine." And my response, I noticed, was a kind of rejection of my own, of the I'm old and therefore. My knee-jerk reaction was to think that I was being slotted into the incapable old person frame. On the contrary, I was being honored by being named auntie and offered a seat among the elders in the room, and that recognition is something that kids have. It is an entirely different cultural construction of.
Right. So it feels very different than, for instance, if you're on a bus and someone gets up to offer you their seat, that's more of this person's not capable because they're older, so they need the seat, as opposed to we respect this person and we want them to be placed in a seat where they can view everything well.
Yeah, for sure.
I guess this is going to be a very difficult question to answer if it's even possible, but what causes ageism? I guess as like a broad concept, within a society.
Not difficult at all. Post-colonial capitalism. And post-colonial as Dorothy Smith taught me when I was a sociology student, she said, capitalists want their workers to show up fed, having had sex, clean, and ready to go, and they get sent back home to the service station where generally the woman was responsible for replenishing food, sex, whatever, and sending him off again the next day. Mm-hmm. And although that model now includes many more women, our workforce looks way different than it did when I studied with Dorothy Smith, and that was 50 years ago. Nevertheless, the model of we want workers to show up shorn of other responsibilities, other connections, other commitments, other anything, is profoundly part of the way we've done our economic and social organizing. And so, as people age out of that workforce, they age out of participation. If we had a differently organized economic system that was built to take value from and include old people in the circles of knowing and the circles of doing, then we certainly wouldn't have ageism as we've constructed it in this culture at this moment.
Right. And do you think there are examples of societies that are built on capitalism that don't have these issues of ageism? No.
Not possible.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to backtrack on that one because my mind went to India or China, and I don't know enough about how, because in both of those countries, I know there to be multi-generational family support systems, particularly where social services type supports or like retirement income, old age security, those kinds of things don't exist. And so the family is the site for community care. And so I shouldn't speak so quickly because I don't know how ageism plays out in that context in relation to the capitalism that underpins.
Right. So the capitalism might be leading a society towards ageism, but as individuals, people might be able to band together to sort of counteract.
I'm not sure. I just honestly, Nicola, I don't know enough to have an opinion about that. I know enough to stop myself when I say no, no, never, and then thinking, wait a second, how do you know? And realizing that no, in fact, I don't know. Mm-hmm. And so it would be interesting to look at the ways that ageism manifests in those countries. But I'm not.
Maybe we can have a future podcast where we can bring in people from different cultures and,
be a good idea.
And have that conversation. How do you think people can recognize when others are being ageist?
Well, it's an interesting question because for the most part, old people are not in the room.
So the old people could recognize it, but everyone else is sort of oblivious because the old people...
there's no old people in the same room as the people who might be oblivious. The people who are in the room, the younger people are at work, by and large. Mm-hmm. Again, any oppression, but in this case, ageism works, is that it's like an erasure of the people outside your normative field of vision. So it doesn't occur to you to look to ask, to any of those kinds of, do any of those kinds of things. So how to recognize it to the folks out there who are old like me, I would say, stop thinking that you're the problem or that it's because you are something or other, or you're not something or other enough, that you're being ignored or excluded or whatever, not taken seriously. And start noticing that this is a social phenomenon of exclusion like sexism and racism and transphobia and all of the other ways that we exclude each other.
Right. We're getting close to the end of my questions.
Mm-hmm.
So is there anything we haven't touched on related to ageism that you wanted to bring up at this point?
The question that I would ask, I guess, in relation to ageism is what do we want the situation to look like here? And in Canada, we have a problem because there's a whole lot of old people and not very many younger people. Because of the ways that the birth rate slowed, there are fewer people to look after the older people than there need to be, or than...
So we're talking about the boomer generation aging?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a boomer.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's just not enough bodies. And we see that playing out in healthcare and education in all kinds of places. But one of the places it's playing out in care for elders. And that means that what we're doing is what we always do, and that is we're importing people from other countries to do that work in ways that have really complicated implications for their own elder care. In other words, Canada has no trouble breaking up families of people who don't live here to bring to this country workers for the period of time that, for whatever purpose we need workers.
Right.
So I would say, folks, we need to be thinking differently about what we want, how we want to be as human beings on the planet. And that question has many, many dimensions, almost all of which we're currently getting wrong. So we white people in particular are like cut off from the land. We don't believe that it's relevant to have consciousness of what has gone before or what's going to come next. So we're essentially automatons walking on the face of the earth doing destruction. It's a really horrifying image, but it's nevertheless true. Like one of the pieces that just I can't get out of my mind is that since the time I started law school, which was 1973, and now 70% of the creatures on the earth are extinct. Wow. Now, drink that in. I don't know how to drink that in, but it's astonishing to me that isn't our central preoccupation. Mm-hmm. That we need to, we urgently, like as in suicidally, need to rethink and reimagine the ways in which we connect with each other and to the earth. And unless we do that, we're all going to hell in the handbasket. That's all there is to it. Old, young, and everybody in between. So it's a much bigger project than what do we do about ageism, particularly. In terms of how would I imagine elder life in a better way than I am likely to experience it, I would be looking at things like co-housing models where there are people of generations who make kind of explicit commitments to the community that we're all going to look after each other, and that elders would continue to have a valuable role in that process. There are some interesting examples already. For example, that in some care homes, people have combined care for the elderly and daycare, so that the little ones come to the elders' home, care home, and are cared for by the elders who are there, to the demonstrable benefit of everybody, of the kids, of the elders, because the kids get, loving attention and life lessons, and the elders get the joy of connecting with kids who need them and being needed. Actually, I always don't like people who say doom and gloom things like we're heading to hell in a handbasket, without acknowledging that there are also ways that we can cultivate different kinds of models that will move us forward in a healthier and more sensibly connected ways. What I would invite people to do is to reflect on who in your own life is old. And I don't care what you mean by old, actually. If you're 20 and you think old is anybody over 40, go for it. But what do you think about old? How does that play for you in terms of the value that you ascribe to that person or the respect that you have for them? Mm-hmm. Where do you look for life lessons? Like to whom do you look when you think about wanting somebody wiser than you, somebody who has, and we have mentors, for example. That's one model, but always, like any oppression, one of the way we start by acknowledging that, we white folks, we all grew up with this model of aging and old age, and this is a culturally pervasive idea that is not anybody's individual fault. Mm-hmm. However, if we continue to enact it, once we figure that out, if we continue to behave in the ways of ageism, then it becomes our responsibility. It's not our fault that we were brought up with an ageist culture, but it's our responsibility to work against it.
Right.
Whether we're young or older, somewhere in between. I think that I think that the question of ageism is, as I said earlier, completely bound up with our cultural ideas about death and dying, and our ridiculous cultural assumption that we're going to live forever, that we have to always look young. All of those kinds of, because those are also pieces of ageism. And that I really do believe this to be true. Until we make friends with death, we're going to keep killing the earth.
Right. Interesting. Now, you mentioned a little while ago about how you're part of the boomer generation. What is your response to I don't know if it's quite as much of a trend anymore, but for a little while there, OK Boomer was popping up all over social media. What would your response to that be?
Missed it.
You missed it. Okay.
Yeah. So what was it? A kind of like, they're there?
It was
their old person?
Well, it was a very dismissive comment, and it was primarily related to people's anger about the ways that the boomer generation destroyed the planet, I think. So looking at someone from your generation who's saying, this is how the world should operate, and then the kids going, well, hold on a second, you screwed the world up, so we're not going to listen to you. And it was just a very dismissive, OK Boomer. And in my mind, it's tricky because in a lot of ways, it's a justified response. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, it also plays into that piece of ageism and older people being dismissed and not seen.
Both things are true.
Mm-hmm.
And it is really true that it's my generation that has most particularly directly messed up the planet. It's not that the individuals in my generation individually thought, okay, let's see how much damage we can do this before we're too old before we're on canes and crutches. Mm-hmm. But rather that we were, and this is really important to understand, that we were enacting a social and economic system. International corporate capitalism requires exploitive practices. That's otherwise, endless growth is the premise of capitalism. Mm-hmm. So yes, it happened in our generation. Yes, we were the ones who did it and were not successful in interrupting it. But that idea remains unchallenged if what you say is OK Boomer. Mm-hmm. Because it's those ways of organizing the economic and social world that have the consequence of, first of all, multi-billionaires, and on the one hand, and destroyed planet on the other. Mm-hmm. So there is something deeply, deeply, deeply messed up about the ways in which we think about human connection to the earth, to productive activity, to connecting together, to supporting each other. All of those things need to change. All of those, both ideas and practices, need to change.
And I think to your point about it not necessarily being a concerted effort to damage the planet, it sounds like it was more coming from a place of ignorance for a lot of people, right? Like these corporations, oil and gas companies, or whatever it is, are destroying the planet, but everyone else is sort of going along with it because they're ignorant to all of the issues that are being caused. And I imagine that's still going on today. There's probably tons of things happening right now that we're all ignorant to, and in 20, 30, 40 years, we're going to find out you were part of the problem. And people are going to say, okay, millennial to me, right? In the future, that's probably going to happen. So I guess, I don't know if there's a question in there, but at some point you have to break that cycle, right?
Well, I have a reflection on there, and that is that I read Rachel Carson when I was in high school and was astonished at what she signaled was coming for the planet. I read Joanna Macy in the 80s and thought, oh my God. And I have been talking about it and ever since. And what's interesting to me is in the 80s, when I talked about it, people would just kind of look at me blankly. Today, if I see somebody says it's a beautiful day out and I say, yeah, but climate change, they go, yeah, I know. So
understand that.
There are a whole bunch of factors that play into that. The first is that in the way we've got the things set up at the moment, we have corporations as the machines of economic activity. Corporations have a reporting period every quarter, like every 3 months. They look at their performance over a period of 3 months, and they're supposed to be making more. And the litmus is, are you making more money? There has been almost no way. Corporations have a legal duty to their shareholders, a legal duty to do that. So within that structure, there's almost no way to think about the planet as anything but a source of more oil or more whatever.
Right.
That whole baked in economic organization made it impossible to think about those questions, literally.
And then they become too big to fail, and the government decides to subsidize them and bail them out.
That too. I'm by no means the first person to say there are fundamental and soul-destroying and people-killing problems with capitalism, corporate capitalism.
Don't even think you're the first person on this podcast.
I won't be the last. And honestly, one of the things about being an old person is I feel like, and I say to my old friends, we're not going to be around to see this play out. What a mess. And what a tragedy for the young ones coming behind us. That's not about ageism exactly. That's about aging.
Well, and I mean, I think it does play into ageism a little bit on the other end of the spectrum too, where kids today are seeing their lives being threatened imminently.
Yeah.
They're saying, I'm not going to make it to my old age anymore unless we change something. And they're taking on
or even if we do.
Even if we do, but they're taking on sort of these drastic actions to try to get people's attention, and because they're kids, they're just being dismissed as, you don't know what you're talking about, or wait until you're an adult and then you can do whatever it is that you want to do. Yeah. And it's just an excuse to not do anything in the meantime. Anyways, that brings us to my last question, which is for people who want to go out and advocate to make this issue better. So I don't know if that means ending ageism. That seems like a very lofty goal, but what advice would you give to someone who wants to advocate to make the world a better place when it comes to ageism?
Well, to the old people, I would say, don't stop participating. Don't take on the idea that you don't have things that are valuable to say. Get on with it, I guess, in some sense. To the younger people, I think I said this, that is, think about the world, think about how the world you want to live in, how you're going to connect to the people in your bio family, your chosen family. Think about ways that you can create robust ways to look after each other, because although in Canada, we are least likely, probably in the world, to be immediately disastrously impacted by climate change. There's no such thing as climate security anymore. And so we need to be learning and teaching from each other in ways that are actively. I mean, for each of us, it's always the challenge of, okay, so what do you want to be saying to yourself at the end of your life? Given that this is the challenge we're up against, how are you going to deal? Mm-hmm. And what do you want your old age to look like? And talk to your elders.
Thank you so much for joining me today to have this conversation. I hope that our audience has learned something from this. I've definitely learned a lot from speaking with you, and I have all the more reason to respect you now, besides your career. So with that, this has been a social justice podcast. I'm Nicola Sperling, your host, and my guest
Barbara
has been...
Findlay.
There you go.
Still
Barbara Findlay.
That's right.
Thanks for joining us, and I'll see you again in 2 weeks.
Bye for now.
You've been listening to a social justice podcast hosted by Nicola Sperling, brought to you by the Flag Shop, and inspired by a social justice coloring book.